So my name is Emily Holland, and I'm the editor of Poet Lore, America's oldest poetry magazine. Link in the chat to check that out. And just welcome to the Writer Center Virtual Craft Chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. Please welcome tonight's guest, Heather Green, author of No Other Rome. Super excited to talk about this, but we'll also be talking about her translations as well in Noontime's One. So Heather, thank you for joining us. And Zach has also put in the chat, please purchase a copy of the books, either via your local independent bookseller, direct from the publisher, or via bookshop.org, where there's a link to No Other Rome there as well. So welcome, Heather. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me. And I wanted to say thanks to you especially for preparing for tonight, but also to Zach Powers and Stephanie, who kind of made the connection for the invitation.
Yeah, this is so exciting, and I'm always thrilled to spend an evening talking about poetry. So to get us started, would you be able to give us a brief introduction about who you are, a little bit about your work, and then maybe read one or two poems for us?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so as you said, this book, No Other Rome, just came out, and about 3 years ago, I think it was 3 years ago, this translation of Tristan Tzara's Noontime's One was published. And actually I was working on both of these at the same time for quite a while. And so I'm really excited to see these come to fruition. Both of them took a while for me to write or translate, and then also once they were accepted for publication, took a really long time to come out. So it's kind of exciting to see it coming to fruition. And I teach at George Mason in the School of Art, and so I that's just I'm really feel so lucky. That's been a great place for me to land, because it gives me a lot of interdisciplinary inspiration for my work. And also I feel in some strange way, thinking a lot about art and aesthetics feeds into translation a lot for me too. So that's kind of an intro, and then I'll read a couple of poems from No Other Rome just to get things started. The first one I wanted to read is actually is directly related to visual art. It's a poem that I wrote after seeing the Yayoi Kusama Infinity Mirrors show that was here in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago. So just one sec, I'm gonna open this blind a little. A minute ago, it was blindingly bright here, and then I guess the clouds came over. I need to make sure I can read this. So anyway, I was really struck by these paintings. A lot of the exhibition was the rooms that you can actually enter that had that were mirrored and had this effect that they were extremely spacious, and had but there were also a bunch of paintings there that were called infinity nets, that basically looked like nets on a black background. And I was really taken with those. And it made me, and later I heard this interview with Paul Muldoon where he talked about this definition of a net by Samuel Johnson, a series of holes connected by string. And immediately I just thought about those paintings. And so that's kind of where this poem came from. It's called A Series of Holes Connected by String, and it has an epigraph from Kusama. When we obliterate nature and our bodies with polka dots, we become part of the unity of our environments. A net, according to Samuel Johnson, a series of holes connected by string. The net of Indra, faceted with jewels, glittering web infinitely reflecting itself and everything else. History told by the victors, the story itself a spoil. Yet the past is not a place. You can't go home again, my dad so often said. He seemed to know home as a time. He had been there in mine. I've never yet let go of him or you because you both were there. Your childhood, mine. Epic, light-drenched vacation, the underwater world bright, coral reefs infinite. And like everything else, I often made it hard. But the water reminded me I was no one. Born in the year of the dog underneath a Sagittarius star, I'm still a loyal wanderer, but oblivion gets in. Once I love, it means ruin. But here I scatter back into the present, bright, fatherless regression of offset mirrors, funny valentines, photographable, gem-like farewell lanterns cast onto the internet, obliterated into pixels, disseminated in liquid crystal before our bodies spoil. I barely remember the islands, the holes, a world now come to fire and ice. So that poem, it kind of like moves all over the place. Thanks. But I also just wanted to mention that like at the ending, when it kind of talks about like casting things out onto the internet, I was partly thinking about, I read a lot of articles about that show and talking about how it was like a show that was like kind of meeting the moment with people wanting to like take pictures of themselves in the infinity rooms and like put them online. And when the show first opened, someone was doing that and they like fell backward and kind of smashed one of the ceramic pumpkins that was part of the exhibition. And they had to close it for a while. And it was like very big deal, like completely sold out, you know, and they had to shut it down for a while and replace it. And so when I was there, as I was walking around, I was really thinking about that connection of like the question of like wanting to photograph something and needing to put yourself in the work kind of. And I don't necessarily really think that's a bad thing, but it definitely was like a presence there. So anyway, I'm going to read another poem that's I think kind of like maybe in conversation with that poem in a way. This poem's called Aristotle is a Skeleton. And I wrote this one a long time ago, and this poem was kind of inspired by reading the beginning of David Foster Wallace's book about infinity, everything and more. And in that book, the preface talks about how there's that sort of beautiful mind, you know, notion that math can kind of like put you in a dangerous place mentally. And Wallace's argument was like that it's really not math, it's abstraction, and it's like the levels of abstraction that you need to be able to engage with. And also he talks a little bit in the intro about how for a long time in the history of math, like Aristotle had sort of closed this logical loophole that let people like be okay with not having the concept of infinity, but that was like kind of erroneous. So he sort of cast him as the villain in that story. So since we're doing a craft talk, I'll just kind of like give you the backstory there. So Aristotle is a skeleton. The skeleton called out for sets of bones to fill the hole. But then you reached your arm in, your fingers stretched down to the unknown, the loam, the moonshine dark. You called abstraction as your fingers shaped into the word for 5, but didn't pull your hand back from the black of the abyss until the digits, still alive, became just 5. You cried, it's too abstract, when your arm snapped back. At the end of the limb stood the absolute value of 5, which looked so vast, but in fact was only that which is not 5. At first, you'd say the skeleton had been the villain, blaming him, but for the lure of the leap, the loss, though lonely. In time, the whole transformed you all the way. So
Thank you so much for reading those. As you were talking about the Kusama exhibit, I was just, when I was reading this too, I was thinking about that and how, the waiting in the lines and the crowdedness, and just, I was like, well, we couldn't do an exhibit like that now because we would, nobody would ever get to go into those tight rooms. But um, it also made me just really miss museums and experiencing art in that way too. Which a lot of these poems did in their references and things like that. And then, of course, with Aristotle as a skeleton, just thinking about math and seeing that absolute value sign in there really took me back to when I used to do math before I became an English major, so I wouldn't have to do math anymore. But to just kick off the chat, I wanted to go back and think about this book in conversation with your translation of Zara, and you mentioned kind of creating them around the same time. So I wonder if you could first just talk about that process, the difference between creating your own work and doing this work of translation, which are sometimes very different, but can also be ways of approaching the craft of writing that can teach you a little bit more about your own process.
yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that question, because like I've been thinking a lot about, and kind of the things that I've been working on lately are writing about kind of like what that connection is between translating and writing. I mean, of course, translating is writing, so that's like part of it. But I wanted to read this quote that I just love from this book, This Little Art by Kate Briggs. That's a book about I'll put the name of it in the chat in case anyone's interested. I definitely recommend this book wholeheartedly. It's a book about translation, but it's also kind of like, it's like a lyric memoir about translation and about translators. And it comes from a quote of Helen Lowe Porter, who was one of the main initial translators of Thomas Mann, calling it like this little art. So anyway, in the book, this is Kate Briggs herself translates Roland Barthes, and especially some of his later lecture series. So that just comes in. She says, the desire to write is the feeling you get from certain readings, the kind of reading that agitates you into making a trace of itself. Or to put it another way, reaching a little further for an answer, Barthes arrives at the following claim. To want to write is to want to rewrite, he says. And then every beautiful work, or even every work to make an impression, every impressive work functions as a desired work. But I would say, and it's here that it starts to get interesting, that every work I read is desirable. Even as I'm desiring it, I experience as incomplete and somehow lost because I didn't do it myself. And I have to in some way retrieve it by redoing it. In this way, to want to write, or to write is to want to rewrite. I want to add myself actively to that which is beautiful and that I lack, as we might put it with an old verb, that I require. So sorry, that was a bit of a long quote, but I feel like that really gets at the core of like kind of all of my different engagements with writing, whether it's like ekphrastic or translating. And as you probably noticed, like most of the poems that I write that aren't about like visual art kind of come out of reading. So that's where I feel like the strongest connection is. And I think also, when I was like a teenager, first really discovering poetry in a kind of a little bit more serious way, I was really obsessed with Tristan Tzara's writing and with like French modernist poetry, like of his contemporaries. And so it was kind of like something that got lost for a while in my life. And then in my 30s, I kind of like picked it back up again and started really translating his work. But it was kind of like this return to something that was so important to me when I was young, so I think that's kind of interesting how like I feel like I've known a lot of other friends too who have kind of like returned to something like that and kind of realized, oh, that was there all along.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That kind of impulse to go back to something now that you have a different perspective or a different way of interacting with it. And did you feel that through translation it made you closer to the work in a different way than some of those early readings?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, and also, one thing that I will say about this Noon Times one is that, and kind of like everything that I've been trying to do, like I have another manuscript that I just finished of Tristan Tzara's like work that's even later. Like this book is from like 38, 39, and the one that I just finished working on is from 1948. And the reason that I really first started working on these is that, I think he's well known as like a Dadaist and as for his manifestos and for like the monocle, kind of his whole persona. But that entire like moment was really pretty much take place by the time he was about 23. And even though I think he certainly, for him, Dada never ended, and I think it sort of was always like the spirit of it was always in all of his work. But I think that like the Dada movement definitely ended. And so most of his work from almost, other than a couple of selecteds and like really great selecteds from Marianne Cause and Lee Harwood, really nothing past that like early Dada period and or especially nothing past the surrealist period had really been translated into English. So I felt like he published over 50 books in his lifetime, and such a tiny fraction of those works are still translated into English. So that's something else that I really wanted. Like I feel like I was kind of waiting for someone to translate this stuff. And finally, I was like, I'm just going to try to do it. I think maybe it'll be easier as like, more things come into the public domain, because it is a little hard to deal with getting the permissions for some of these, and it's expensive. But anyway, that's I forgot what the question actually was, but that's
No, that's great. I think, yeah, in all the kind of supplemental research I was doing, diving back into, the Dada movement and things like that, just to find some access points. It is interesting, like that's so brief. And so I think that it's great to be able to not only access these works yourself through translation, but then to bring them to a new audience now in their translated form as well. And yeah, I'm very excited to have been able to read this and experience some of that work, and to see kind of, I don't want to say ghosts, but maybe Tzara's presence throughout your own poems in No Other Rome. So could you talk a little bit about incorporating some of either the style or even, his physical presence in these poems and in this book, and how you kind of negotiated that work?
Thanks. Well, I really love that you felt like you could see an influence in there, because like I don't, I mean, there's definitely some overt like talking about Tzara in the book. Like there's a one poem called The Problem with Sammy Rosenstock, and that's actually Tzara's original name. Or I mean, maybe not Sammy, but Samuel Rosenstock was his name that he was born with. So there's one poem in there that's really overtly about him in a way. And then there's another one that's let us try for once not to be right, which that sentence is a quote from one of the Dada manifestos. So a couple of the poems, oh, and there's one other one too. So a couple of the poems are really about Tzara and about reading him, and just kind of like, almost like I look at it as the way that you might engage with like a painting and sort of like let it run through your body and like become a poem somehow. I feel like these kind of worked that way for me with reading Zara's work. But as far as like in not being overtly referenced, I haven't really been able to like detect that, but I feel like it's very welcome.
So I just see a question in the chat from Barbara, which reminds me to remind everyone, as questions come up, please put them in the chat, because I do try to just keep an eye on that and incorporate that into the conversation. So Barbara's asking, do you feel that Dada and the times that you quote as the years of the work translated as bearing some relation to a time we're going through universally in a later century, more than 70 years later? So I guess, do you see some correlation between that time and the time at which your translation is published?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. I do. In fact, like if you on the back of the book, instead of doing like blurbs, we just put this quote that's actually from a lecture that Zara gave in 1937 at a writers' congress that he organized in Madrid and Valencia. So it was this whole group of like writers and artists that were trying to get support for the anti-fascist cause in the Spanish Civil War. And this is like a translation of a quote from the address he gave there. We must affirm our will to live, and this will to live has but one meaning today: fighting the dark forces of the basest instincts. And at some point he refers to Franco as like a low-level Nero. And there were all of these different quotes from that conference that felt like, as I was really working on this introduction during like the very beginning of the Trump presidency, I was really feeling all this resonance, although obviously completely, very different situations, but still, I think that for Tristan Tzara being like the Dada period, I guess, I feel like a lot of people mainly contextualize that as being like a reaction to World War I and total war and things like that. But after that period, Zara got like became very serious and became like a very serious activist, although I think he was serious about Dadaism, but serious about a very unserious thing. But then from then on out, he was really working in like various different anti-fascist causes for during the Spanish Civil War, and then leading up to World War II, and then in the resistance in France. And he never left France during World War II, although he was Jewish, and at times like he was hiding in a different place or moving from house to house every single day. And at some point toward the end, I think he was living with Sonia Delaunay and some other writers and artists somewhere near Toulouse, in a like kind of hidden out in the country. But yeah, and he refused to publish any poetry during all of that time because he didn't want to support the regime. So the book that I just finished working on, Parler Seul, or Speaking Alone, was actually, he wrote it while he was visiting this psychiatrist in a sanitarium right after World War II, where a lot of displaced people were there, like in a therapeutic setting. And he was there somewhat as a guest, somewhat as a patient, from what I understand, and became really close with a lot of the people there. So a lot of the poems are dedicated to like all the various people he befriended in this place. So anyway, I feel like through that book and this book, there are all sorts of resonances with today. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely picked up on some of that as well reading. And I think that just goes to speak about the lasting kind of universality of poetry, how it can speak to one moment and then be translated and brought back into another moment. While we're speaking about the translations, I'll loop in Pat's question as well. How have you bridged the literal translation to the poetic and emotional sense of the writing?
That's a really good question too. And I feel like that's kind of the ultimate question with translation. But I guess for with with these poems, one thing that's a little unusual about them, I'll just like let you see a little glimpse there. There's no punctuation at all and no capitalization. So one thing that's sort of like maybe I feel is a little bit liberating as a translator is that the unit of the line becomes like extremely important in these poems because in a way, like if for those of you who've read that book, The Art of the Poetic Line from James Longenbach, he talks about like end stop, parsed and enjambed lines, like lines that end where the sentence or the main clause ends, lines that are enjambed, like where they really don't end at the end of the phrase or the line or the sentence, like where they're maybe a little bit of a cliffhanger. Um, and then lines that end, the ones that he calls parsed are like the lines where it's sort of like where you might naturally take a breath, or it might be like where there's an introductory phrase like in the morning, line break. We went to this place, line break, and this happened. That would basically be parsed. Like it's just helping you parse the syntax. And I feel like most of these poems are somewhat adhering to like that type of line break. And so I kind of look at it as the lines are almost like Legos. Like they like, so I'm kind of translating it in using the unit of the line, but sometimes like rearranging them because of the way the syntax works to make the sentence make sense. But what's really interesting is a lot of times a line could belong to the line before or the line after, with a slightly different meaning if you read it one way or the other. And so so anyway, that's kind of been like the organizing principle to me. And then of course there's so much like sound play and word play and like hijinks happening in the original text. And so I think I haven't often been able to like put the same type of sound play in the same spot, but I have tried to like take advantage of any opportunity I see to do some like similar types of like alliteration or double entendre, so that it's like it's getting in there, like going back to Kate Briggs, who I talked about earlier. Like one of the big arguments of her book is like, look to the whole. Don't you can't think about a translation as by scrutinizing each word. You need to like kind of look to the whole. And she talks about it having like these two attributes that it, like if you were building a table, you would want the table to have like what she calls soundness and comeliness. Like it needs to work and be strong and stable, but it also needs to be sort of like aesthetically appealing. And so I guess like I like thinking about it that way a little bit more, like maybe as each poem as a whole for the most part, but also the book, because both of these books have a pretty concise vocabulary. There's like only so many words being used, and there's like a patterning happening with those words across the book. So that's another thing that like in the later editing stages I've tried to like attend to a little bit. Not exactly word for word though, not like every time he uses this one word I'm going to translate it exactly the same way, but at least think about that, doing that. And think about how that patterning is playing out.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad that you brought up that notion of sound play, because I really felt a lot of echoes across the poems in No Other Rome. And, we get that kind of echoing O from the title of the collection, but then we get so many different echoes throughout the book through repetitions of sound and sound play, but also just words that keep reappearing. So could you talk a little bit about sort of conceptualizing that across a collection as maybe a thread through the poems? How did you balance, is this too much? Is this enough repetition, and kind of juggle that sound concern across the poems.
That's like, I'm not sure in the translation. I feel like I definitely did a lot of, like, in both of them, I did a lot of like reading the whole thing aloud and trying to like hear it, for first of all, and and then I also actually in both cases used like this feature in Word where you can like get the list of all the words that occur in the order from like occur most to occur least. It's kind of similar to like the word cloud thing that people sometimes do, but it just gives you like a list. And so and partly with the Zara, I did that because I did it with the French and I did it with the English and kind of tried to think about what types of recurrences were happening. And I feel like I had a little more objectivity to like think about it very systematically, I mean, when I'm really first working on it, I wouldn't be thinking in those terms at all, but later in the process, but with this manuscript, it was just like, it took me a really long time to think about, like, to get it into sort of feeling coherent, because really, like, I feel like there's such a trend in the last like 10 years toward books that are like very thematically tight, or kind of a project, like 50 poems about the death penalty, or like Shakespearean sonnets, like a book that I actually like from Jill McDonough that had that format. And this is kind of the opposite of that. This is kind of just like a lot of poems that I wrote over like more than 10 years. And so, and there wasn't it. I mean, the only thing that was really unifying the collection is just like that me, and so while I was trying to find sort of a logic and a title, I finally thought of doing that same thing. And then I started seeing like, oh, okay, like the word water like appears like all over the place in this. And I didn't even realize that, And so, then I started being able to see it a little more like mathematically. And I even made this little, I saw this chart that the poet Heather Crissell made when she was working on her book, The Crying Book, which is like, like, did you see this chart that she made by chance?
Yeah, it's like all color coded, and yeah.
It's like a handmade spreadsheet, like picture that you drew it on like grid paper. And it was because it's a book that's like in these lyric fragments, but it's like a nonfiction book, but in these short fragments. And she said when she was ordering this book, she just finally like color coded them kind of by like theme or tone, and then like organized the whole thing by like filling out these colored dots. And so finally I sort of like coded the poems for like these certain things they contained. And I like put all of the titles on Post-its with all the codes so I could kind of think of it all at once, because that was the hard thing. Like, I know a lot of writers print out the whole thing and put it up on the wall, all the pages, and I had tried doing that, but I was just lost. And so finally, like shrinking it down to where I could like see it all in one field of vision, with the Post-its was like what made me finally be able to kind of like find the logic for it, as much as there is one.
No, that's great. I just found the LitHub link where Heather kind of talks about it, so I would put it in the chat here. But yeah, something I was also going to ask you about was just the way that you organize the different sections. There's 4 sections, and first of all, I'm very relieved that you say that this is just a kind of a collection of the poems that you had, because I just came out of an MFA program, and I think that there is a lot of that pressure to have a project book. And a lot of us were like, well, we're coming out of here with all these poems, but we don't really know what to do with them, because they're not, maybe they have some things in common, but they're not theoretically all around a project. So I do love that this is kind of, going back to that, but there are definitely threads that connect, of course. So could you talk about the way that you you took to organize the book. I'm sure it took a few different structural changes and things like that to get it to its final state.
Yeah, well, first of all, like regarding that like project or like thematically really unified book versus um a lot of poems that you wrote book. I had this teacher, Maggie Dietz, when I was in grad school, who was like, I wanted to mention something she said to me, like that was, maybe like 2008 or 9. And project books were really big at the time. It was around the time that Dorothy Alasky wrote this little pamphlet, I think on Ugly Duckling, that's called Poetry is Not a Project. And Maggie just was like, you do not, that's fine if that's what you're working on and you're doing something that's like very research based, but if not, that's also fine. And like your poems are all written by you and your like concerns and experiences, and like to someone else who's not in your brain, there will be a through line, and I that was really liberating for me when she, like getting that perspective from her. And I think that let me just like be okay with it or just be glad about it, kind of. But the other thing was that as you might have noticed, like you mentioned the epigraphs at the beginning of each section, I am like kind of an epigraph hound, and I had so many epigraphs in here. And I finally had a manuscript consultation with someone who just said, like, no, there's just like too much like extra matter here. It just feel it's too much. It's like getting in the way of the poems. And so that was kind of the final step after I did the post-it ordering. And then I really got rid of, and I sort of like snuck some of the epigraphs into the notes. I turned some of them into the titles of poems. I made some of them, I kind of like incorporated them a little bit better. I think maybe that's what needed to happen, but I did chop some of them off. So, so that was, really good advice. I think it made it stronger, and there's still a lot of epigraphs, but I needed to like pull out anything I possibly could, I think. And yeah, anyway, I think that like I really love that intertextuality that the epigraphs bring in, and like kind of pointing out to another work and putting your work in conversation with another work. But it was maybe becoming a little bit too much of a, like leaning on it too much.
I really love how the collection does bring in so much kind of outside, I guess, elements. The first poem references Prince, and then of course we get references to different art and artists and writers. Can you talk about, the way that you sort of negotiate bringing in these references without over explaining? How do you give us, for instance, in the poem Treachery, like the hint at Marilyn Monroe, but not using her name and things like that? Because I found a lot of references that came about, on my rereading, and maybe even as I was doing some different Googling and things like that too, which I love with poetry, but I know that sometimes there's a pressure to not make things hidden, make things a little bit more on the surface level. But I like that there's a mix of both there. So could you talk about sort of the way that you bring in these elements without letting them overtake the work, but also giving the reader enough to keep going?
Yeah, I think that's been like something I've struggled with a lot, actually. That question of like, it's really hard for me to assess how like understandable my poems might be to another person. I think like that Yayoi Kusama poem, I like showed that poem to an editor at one point, And I felt like I was just like bleeding on the page. Like it was almost like too obvious, you know? And she read this poem and just said like, I have no idea what you're talking about here.
Mm.
And so that was kind of like a little bit of a rude awakening for me, because that at that point it was the first poem in the manuscript, and it had some other digressions in it about like Cesar Chavez and other things that I remember from my youth. So anyway, I think that that was useful for me to think about, okay, like that needs to not be the first poem. Like, and I really tried to think about that in ordering these poems, to try to like think about, like, for some of the ones that are a little less accessible, I don't really love that word, but a little bit more difficult to get into, of maybe like leaving some breadcrumbs earlier on, or kind of doing another poem that might like set you up to understand a little bit of what's going on in this other poem. Um, so, so, um, Oh yeah. Yes, how understandable is someone to another person? That's actually that is kind of a big theme of the book though. I think I'm also not great at judging that. But anyway, yeah, that's so that was a big challenge. So one of the things that I used as a guiding force for that though is I never want to feel like my poems are full of like inside jokes.
Mm.
I hate when I read poems that feel like they're just full of like inside jokes among a certain like cadre of writers. And I mean, it's one thing to take like a Frank O'Hara poem that's like referencing some friends by name, but that's still like building in enough substance that you're kind of like eavesdropping on the party and you're glad to be there. That's fine. But you know, when it really feels like it's kind of like only for those in the know, like I would never want my poems to feel that way. So that's one thing that where I did take some things out that were kind of like hermetic, you know, or like but but then but on the other hand, on the flip side of that, I do feel like people can like Google things and easily follow the thread if they want to. And I feel like I enjoy reading collections where there are some things knitted in that I like can follow the threads and figure it out. You know, like I think about like David Ferry, who's like one of my writing heroes, and often includes like texts that he's translated into his own collections, like maybe from Catullus um, or like chunks of his translation of the Aeneid made it into two of his like selected works. And then in the latest book, Bewilderment, he even included 3 poems from his like colleague, and then wrote poems responding to those poems. And they're all in the book, you know? And so I guess but his work has a lot of that kind of stuff, like where you really need to like track down and learn, and a lot of the poems are responding to each other in these really subtle ways. So I feel like that was a big inspiration for me in thinking about how to bring a lot in, and then like trust that your reader will either figure it out or maybe just be able to have a good enough experience of the work, even if they didn't, where there's something there.
Yeah, I definitely feel that here. And even with the end notes, I mean, I'm one of those readers that reads the acknowledgments and end notes first if they're there, and
Me too.
because I love to just kind of know like what I'm getting into, and um, between that and obviously the epigraphs and kind of the other references there, I mean, there's so much within this book that it very much is its own kind of world, but then there's so much that's reaching out, and so I think trusting the reader to, branch together those pieces and kind of make that web themselves, is definitely a strong point of the collection, or at least for my reading experience. I always have a lot of fun with, one window on Google and then I'm reading on the side, so I can be typing and just, it just adds another level to the poem without making the poem a mystery or something like that. So I really appreciated that. Let me see that. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I just want to ask so many things. And I've appreciated just kind of how we've been able to dive into some of these craft elements here. I wanted to go back. You mentioned water coming up in your kind of one of the top words in the collection, and I noticed that as well. There's like water as snow in some places and water moving, and there's this idea of time and permanence and fragility throughout the collection. The first poem talks about, what it means to be everlasting. So could you talk a little bit about that overarching theme and how maybe something like that helped structure the collection, or framing it with that first poem, and then kind of talking about the considerations of art, and then we kind of moved to Italy and the ruins and Rome and things like that as well, throughout the pieces.
Sure. Yeah, that's and I just wanted to say that like some of the two of the people that were like with me in Rome when I was writing some of these are here tonight. So
Okay.
so they probably really will get a lot of the things that are going on in the more like the last section, which has a lot of the poems that really reference Rome directly. But yeah, I think that's like that first, so putting the first poem being the first poem is a poem that's called If Anything Is Everlasting, It Can Only Be One Thing. And it's a poem I like wrote along with my students about using this prompt of just like taking one word, and especially a word that maybe has like kind of a layered meaning. Like I remember one of my students wrote a great poem using this prompt about the word cleave, like how you cleave something in half, but you could also like hug something. And so I wrote using the word last. And I had them all like look up the word in the OED and like print it out and like, have like all of the notes and first uses in front of them, so they could even think about using quotations and so forth. And one of the quotations that came up for last was from Macbeth, of from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And it was funny when I wrote this poem, I realized like I'd never really thought about how last means to like keep going and be preserved. And it also could mean the very last, like the end of something. And so, and it was right at the same time as like my dad had passed away, and my life was changing really dramatically. Like I just like had children and moved to a new place. And so I think I felt very unsettled, but also like was thinking a lot about like generational time and really like feeling connected in this different way after I lost my dad, with like kind of feeling more connected to him in a different way, and feeling like connected with this sweep of time in a way that I really hadn't felt before. Like I was really part of something. And so I think that ended up being like a thing that organized this book a lot for me, was thinking about those questions about like what can last. And like, of course, when you're in Rome, you're constantly thinking about like these layers of time and civilization. And also, I was really lucky when I was there to be around some people who were all making incredible art. And so thinking about really like what I guess like not necessarily thinking about Rome from the perspective of just thinking about the antiquities, but thinking about it as like this hub, like the eternal city, this center of things, but also like that in and of itself, because a lot thinking about like how climate change is affecting it, and and feeling like even as you're like looking at the grandeur of this place and how long and how much history is here, you're also constantly thinking about it disappearing. And so I think like that was kind of like on a macro level what I was thinking about, more on a personal micro level too, like these different scales of time feeling really expansive and generous, and other times feeling like scarce and perilous, you know, like I know, just like suddenly flipping between those two frames like all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And that seems to connect back to what you mentioned with the Kusama poem about, the way that someone broke one of those pieces, that kind of fragility, but also the grandeur of it when it's there. And so I think, yeah, that's definitely something that I picked up on. And it's also very kind of visually evident in the cover with the marble that's kind of being split by the other piece of rock. Maybe it's marble as well. But I think that, I love just when the cover is able to evoke something thematically that seems to be teased out by the poems too. So I think that was very well done as well.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was so grateful that I actually, like, when we asked the artist if we could use this piece, I like did not expect a yes. You know, I just was like, just putting it out there. And I was so grateful that he said yes. His name is Kevin Francis Gray. And I just, right when I saw this piece, I just like immediately knew that would be the perfect fit. And I love how this, like, to me, this piece of like onyx that's like going through the girl's head is like kind of makes me think of a book, you know, just like that's like when you're really reading, like it's just right in your head. And but also like Kevin Francis Gray's work is like often using marble and like using Carrara marble and like using all of these materials that are found in Italy and associated with classical sculpture, but in these like really slightly different ways. Like some of the figures have these like almost like look like whipped cream or are like a little bit grotesque, but like you have to do a double take. At first you think it's kind of a classical sculpture and you look back and it's really different. So I just love that.
Yeah, I'm looking at the cover now, and where, at first glance, it's like, oh, yeah, it's like a beautiful marble bust. But then where the eyes would be, they're almost like fingerprints, as if the marble is clay and is able to be like moved around in that way. So, yeah, that's so interesting. And the way it plays off kind of some of the themes of the poems, I think is a great back and forth between, what it means to have something that is solid but also malleable and changeable over time. And yeah, I think that was really great. We have a few minutes left, and I know there's always so much pressure on the last question. If anyone in the chat has a burning question or maybe something that I missed as some comments were coming in, please do add it, or else I'm happy to ask some things to wrap us up. I know you mentioned that you finish a new translation of Zara and you're kind of working on some other things. So what is kind of next for you on like the big project now that you have your collection out and this translation out as well?
Well, I'm working on that Parley Soul collection, and I'm hoping, like, I'm meeting with someone tomorrow who's going to give me some feedback on it. So I'm very excited about that. And I'm actually also translating a contemporary novella right now, which I've never done anything with fiction before, and I'm really excited about that. I've got maybe a third of it done, and so I'm hoping to keep working on that this summer. And then I'm also, it's funny you asked me a lot about the sonnets in the questions that you
Yes,
sent me
yeah.
before. And the next project that I'm working on, I think will be more like thematically a coherent, partly because like, since this one just took me such a long time to write, like, 10 to 15 years. My goal is to like write a draft of another manuscript, but I already have like a lot of notes for it. But to hopefully write a whole draft of it this summer, because I feel like it would be nice to just like, to kind of play with time and be like, all right, this one I'm going to do in a like a very circumscribed bit of time. And it may end up being somewhat sonnety, because it's partly about translation and replication, and like genetic replication and replication within language. And so that's kind of the big thing that I'm trying to figure out right now, is like, because I want there to be like a form that where the text replicates, to sort of like enact that. But that's the part that I haven't quite figured out yet.
Yeah. Wow, that's exciting. Yeah, I definitely I feel like a lot of my first drafts tend to come out sonnety, like they're like 14 lines. And so whenever I see something that's kind of approximating that, I'm always like, okay, let me just check it. And I loved, that extra level to some of these poems here. And yeah, that sounds exciting. I can see like linked sonnets, like a long kind of crown sequence or something like that working. Yeah, that's fun. I think Pat had a question that I think is a nice ending question. Has translating enriched your poetry or acted as a muse for your own poetry?
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say that like, I think that part of why this took so long is that I had a lot of years in there where I was really like heavily like taking care of babies and moving and doing a lot of things that were taking me out of the, like I wasn't sleeping a lot. And so I wasn't really in this perfect conditions for writing. And sort of for me, like translating really like sustained my writing practice through all that time. And I don't really view it as secondary, but it is something more that I can like just have 2 hours and sit down and do it. Whereas, and know that like something will come out of it. Whereas with just sitting down to the blank page when you're kind of tired and, it's a little different. So also like intellectually, I can't think of anything like more fun and it really is just so enjoyable. There's something really different about it in that sense, that it's like just kind of like problem solving, but also poetry and music, or like even with the fiction, it's there is just like sort of the most close and active reading you can do, basically. And so it's like reading times 11 plus writing. So I really, it's been like, I feel so lucky that I discovered it in grad school, because I don't think it just hadn't really occurred to me as something I could pursue or somehow until I took a class in it. And I feel like for a lot of people, that I hear that story a lot, that people just like, it just didn't really cross their mind. And I know that also in some like ways, if in literary scholarship, it's kind of maybe been undervalued a little bit, but I think that that's been changing, and like translation is becoming more visible and valued. So, I mean, I feel like I would really want to do it either way, but it is nice to see, translators like enjoying some, like there's a discourse around translation that seems really thriving right now.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that through our submissions with Poet Lore, we accept translations, and I think it's very vibrant, and there's a lot of people even translating writers together, like they're working with the original language writer in that kind of collaborative way too. And I think um, that there's so much happening, either bringing older works into English so that they could be more widely read, or translating people while they're still writing. It's exciting to see for sure.
Yeah, that is another nice thing, that it sort of lends itself to collaboration in a certain way that, like, for me, writing poetry does not. But I would love to do like a collaboration with someone. I think on translation, I think that would be a really fun endeavor.
Yeah, add that to your summer project list.
Yeah. I know, my super realistic summer project list.
Hey, if we don't have the list, then we don't keep pushing for it. So I think that's great. And I think that we're about out of time. So I just want to thank you all for coming, asking your questions, and thank you, Heather, for just sharing so much. I feel like I've learned so much from you by reading these books and by talking with you. And Zach has put the link to buy the book in the chat. Please, please, please go buy No Other Rome. Support writers, support indie bookstores. Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Okay. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. And Emily, thank you so much. Like, it's really moving to have my work read so attentively and generously. So thank you. I hope we get to meet in real life one of these days.
Yes, we must. And your poems really had me dying to go back to museum too. So I'm excited for all of these things to be opening up and safely. And yeah, we'll have to do a get together to talk more, because I have so many questions that we didn't even get to, which is always the nature of these. But thank you so much for being so open and generous with your answers today.